Great Patriotic War is full of mysteries, many of which remain hidden in classified archives. One of the most fascinating and little-known chapters of this war is the story of Soviet saboteurs who infiltrated enemy lines wearing German military uniforms. These people risked not only their lives, but also their honor, because if they were captured in enemy uniform, they would automatically become spies with all the consequences that entailed. Who were these invisible warriors? How did they prepare for their deadly missions? And what contribution did they make to the overall victory? If you are interested in the unknown history of the Great Patriotic War, subscribe to our channel and like our videos. In the comments, let's discuss a controversial question. Can the use of enemy uniforms in military operations be considered a violation of the laws of war, or is it simply an effective tactical ploy? June 22, 1941, changed not only the map of Europe, but also the concept of warfare. When German tanks crossed the border of the Soviet Union, the Red Army Command was faced with the urgent need to develop new methods of fighting a superior enemy. Already in the first weeks of the war, it became clear that traditional methods of warfare were insufficient against the well-oiled military machine of the Third Reich. Daring plans were hatched in the depths of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs and the main intelligence directorate of the General Staff. One of the most unexpected and risky ideas was to use Soviet saboteurs in German military uniforms. This concept seemed insane even to experienced intelligence officers. Disguised Red Army soldiers were to infiltrate deep behind enemy lines, posing as Wehrmacht or SS troops. The initiator of the creation of such groups was Pavel Mikhailovich Fitin, Deputy People's Commissar of Internal Affairs. Back in July 1941, he sent a memorandum to Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin with a proposal to organize special sabotage units. The document emphasized that the use of German uniforms would allow Soviet fighters to move freely through occupied territory and strike where they were least expected. Initially, the idea was met with skepticism by the military command. The generals rightly pointed out the many risks: the need for perfect knowledge of the German language, thorough study of the enemy's military regulations, and the peculiarities of their behavior and mentality. In addition, there was a moral problem. According to international law, saboteurs captured in enemy uniform were to be shot as spies. However, the catastrophic situation at the front forced the country's leadership to reconsider its attitude toward unconventional methods of warfare. By August 1941, a decision had been made to create experimental groups. The first units were formed on the basis of the NKVD border troops, which included people with excellent knowledge of foreign languages and experience working in border areas. Special attention was paid to the selection of candidates. In addition to impeccable political reliability, saboteurs had to have acting skills, nerves of steel, and a willingness to sacrifice themselves. Preference was given to people from the western regions of Ukraine and Belarus who had heard German since childhood and were familiar with European culture. The first training centers were located deep in the rear, far from prying eyes. Here, future saboteurs not only studied German and military affairs, but also immersed themselves in the atmosphere of the German army. The instructors were often former prisoners of war who agreed to cooperate with the Soviet side, as well as emigrants from Germany who found themselves in the USSR for various reasons. At the same time, technical issues were being resolved. Soviet industry set up production of exact copies of German military uniforms, insignia, and documents. The manufacture of metal parts, buttons, buckles, and metal bars was particularly difficult. Every detail had to meet German standards, as the enemy's experienced eye could spot the slightest fake. The first attempts to use saboteurs in German uniforms showed the complexity of the undertaking. Already in September 1941, several experimental groups were sent to the enemy's rear in the Smolensk area. The results were disastrous. Only 3 of the 12 saboteurs returned alive, and they came back empty-handed. An analysis of the initial failures revealed a number of serious problems. The main one was an underestimation of the psychological factor. Even well-trained fighters were lost at the first contact with real German soldiers. Tension and fear of being exposed led to mistakes in speech and unnatural behavior. The Germans, with their highly developed sense of discipline and order, quickly noticed the inconsistencies. The fate of Lieutenant Alexander Petrovich Kozlov's group was particularly tragic. 5 saboteurs, dressed in Wehrmacht uniforms, were supposed to blow up a railway bridge near Vyazma. The operation was carefully planned, and the fighters underwent intensive training. But when their documents were checked at a checkpoint, one of the group members was unable to correctly answer a question about his hometown, which was indicated in his fake documents. A German sergeant suspected something was wrong and ordered the entire group to be detained for further investigation. 4 saboteurs were killed in the ensuing firefight, and Lieutenant Kozlov was seriously wounded but managed to escape into the forest. 3 days later, he reached his comrades, bringing valuable information about the reasons for the failure. His report formed the basis for a radical review of the methods used to train sabotage groups. Another group, commanded by Senior Lieutenant Ivan Semenovich Morozov, encountered technical problems. The fake documents, hastily produced, contained errors in the dates and seals, which immediately caught the eye of a German officer. Fortunately, the check took place at dusk, and the saboteurs managed to take advantage of the enemy's confusion to escape into the darkness. Serious difficulties also arose with equipment. Soviet gunsmiths had not yet learned how to accurately copy German small arms and ammunition. Even PPSH submachine guns, carefully disguised as German models, had a distinctive firing sound that could give the saboteurs away. Attempts to use captured weapons were also not always successful. Soviet soldiers were unfamiliar with their features and often made mistakes in handling them. The NKVD and GRU leadership drew the right conclusions from these initial failures. A fundamentally new system for training saboteurs was developed. Instead of accelerated courses lasting several weeks, special schools were established with training lasting from 3 to 6 months. The program included not only language and military training, but also an in-depth immersion in German culture, history, and geography. Special attention was paid to psychological training. Future saboteurs were trained not only by military instructors, but also by actors, psychologists, and linguists. Cadets learned not just to speak German, but to think like Germans, adopting their manners, gestures, and behavioral characteristics. Entire simulation training grounds were created, recreating the environment of German military units. It gradually became clear that the success of such operations depended on many small details. Saboteurs had to know not only military ranks and the structure of the German army, but also popular songs, cigarette brands, and regional dialects. The slightest mistake could cost not only the life of the agent, but also the entire group. By October 1941, it became clear that sporadic sabotage operations could not have a serious effect. It was necessary to create permanent special units with professionally trained fighters. The decision to form such units was made at the highest level by Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin himself, following a report from the heads of the special services. The first specialized unit was a separate motorized rifle brigade for special purposes, formed under the 4th Directorate of the NKVD of the USSR. Colonel Artur Karlovich Sprogis, an experienced Czechist of Latvian origin who spoke German fluently and had extensive experience working in European countries, was appointed commander of the brigade. Sprogis understood that the success of future operations depended on the careful selection of personnel. The brigade was recruited exclusively from volunteers from among career state security officers, border guards, and intelligence officers. Those from the Baltic states, Western Ukraine, and Belarus, where the population traditionally spoke several languages, were particularly valued. The brigade had a regular strength of 800 men, divided into 6 special companies. Each company specialized in a specific type of operation: sabotage of transport, destruction of warehouses and supply bases, elimination of high-ranking officers, radio intelligence, and communications. This organization made it possible to train narrow specialists with in-depth knowledge in a specific field. In parallel with the NKVD brigade, a similar unit was created within the military intelligence system. A separate special purpose regiment of the GRU was headed by Colonel Ivan Grigorievich Starinov, a legendary saboteur who had honed his guerrilla warfare tactics during the Spanish Civil War. Starinov brought invaluable experience in asymmetric warfare to the training of saboteurs. The creation of a training base required enormous effort. Secret training grounds were built in the remote forests of the Moscow and Gorky regions, where German military towns were recreated with all the attributes of Wehrmacht life. Cadets lived for months in conditions as close to reality as possible. They wore German uniforms, ate German rations, and spoke only German. The instructors came from a wide variety of sources. In addition to Soviet intelligence officers who spoke German, German communist émigrés, Austrian anti-fascists, and Czech and Polish patriots were actively recruited. Defectors from the German army were particularly valuable, as they could tell the trainees about real life in the Wehrmacht from the inside. The training program was designed for 6 months of intensive study. In addition to language training, the cadets studied the structure of the German armed forces, military regulations, and the supply and communication systems. Much attention was paid to the psychological profile of the typical German soldier, his habits, fears, prejudices, and ways of thinking. The technical side of the training included studying German weapons and military equipment. Saboteurs had to be able not only to fire German automatic rifles and machine guns, but also to disassemble them with their eyes closed, eliminate jams, and load ammunition correctly. Knowledge of enemy technology allowed them not only to successfully disguise themselves, but also to inflict maximum damage during sabotage operations. The training of radio operators was particularly difficult. German radio stations had completely different technical characteristics compared to Soviet models. Moreover, the Germans used complex coding systems and frequently changed call signs. Soviet specialists had to gather information about the work of German signalmen bit by bit. Learning the German language and culture became the cornerstone of the training of Soviet saboteurs. It was not enough to simply learn grammar and vocabulary. It was necessary to completely immerse oneself in the enemy's mentality and understand their psychology and behavioral characteristics. This task proved to be much more difficult than originally anticipated. The main problem was that most of the candidates for saboteurs had only a superficial knowledge of German. Even those who had studied it at school or university were mainly familiar with the literary form, which was far removed from the army jargon and dialectal features of the various regions of Germany. German soldiers spoke a mixture of literary language, military slang, and regional dialects. Linguistic consultants brought in to assist with the training program identified several critical issues. First, the saboteurs had to learn not only the vocabulary, but also the pronunciation characteristics typical of different parts of Germany. Bavarians spoke very differently from Prussians, and Austrians had their own unique speech patterns. An incorrect accent could immediately give away an imposter. Second, nonverbal communication was extremely important. Germans had a distinctive manner of holding themselves, specific gestures, and a certain distance in communication. Soviet soldiers, accustomed to comradely relations and informal communication, had to learn German formality and strict observance of subordination. A unique training method was developed to address these challenges. Cadets were divided into groups of 10 to 12, each of which was assigned a German-speaking mentor. The teachers were German communist immigrants, Austrian social democrats who had fled the Nazi regime, and even a few German prisoners of war who agreed to cooperate. Classes were conducted exclusively in German from the first day of training. It was forbidden to utter even a single word in Russian, even in an informal setting. The cadets were given German names and biographies, which they had to memorize and never forget. They became Hans, Fritz, and Wilhelm, and had to live in these roles permanently. Particular attention was paid to learning military terminology and statutory formulations. The saboteurs memorized military ranks, names of branches of the armed forces, and commands and phrases used in the German army. The slightest mistake in subordination or an incorrectly pronounced command could be fatal. Cultural training included studying German history, geography, literature, and art. Cadets had to know popular songs, poems, historical events, and personalities. They studied German cuisine, holidays, and religious traditions. Each saboteur was given a legend, a fictional biography indicating their place of birth, education, work, and marital status. Psychological training helped cadets get into the role of a German soldier. They worked with professional actors who taught them the basics of transformation. Future saboteurs learned not only to speak like Germans, but also to think like them, to adopt their value system, prejudices, and stereotypes. Knowledge was tested in the form of rigorous exams. Cadets were awakened unexpectedly in the middle of the night and forced to answer questions under stress. The instructors created situations that were as close as possible to combat conditions, where the slightest mistake or inaccuracy could mean the failure of the entire operation. The manufacture and procurement of authentic German military uniforms was a separate and extremely difficult task, on which the success of all sabotage operations depended. The Soviet light industry, which had been reorganized for military purposes, had to master the production of exact copies of German military uniforms that were indistinguishable from the originals in terms of quality and appearance. Initially, Soviet craftsmen tried to make uniforms based on samples obtained from dead German soldiers. However, it quickly became clear that simple copying was not enough. German military uniforms had many technical features, specific cuts, special fabric processing methods, and unique metal details. Even the color of the fabric had to be reproduced accurately. German cloth had a characteristic shade that was immediately noticeable to experts. The production of insignia and awards was particularly difficult. German epaulets, lapels, and cockades were manufactured according to strictly defined standards using special materials and technologies. Soviet jewelers and engravers had to recreate the smallest details of German military insignia down to the millimeter. The slightest deviation from the original could reveal a fake. To solve this problem, a special workshop was set up at one of Moscow's light industry enterprises. It was headed by Pyotr Ivanovich Kuznetsov, an experienced technologist who had worked at a textile factory before the war. Under his leadership, the capital's best seamstresses, weavers, and dyers mastered the secrets of German military production. The workshop's first major achievement was the reproduction of the German field uniform of 1941. They managed not only to copy the appearance, but also to recreate the cut, which ensured comfort and a characteristic fit. Soviet tailors studied every seam and every fold of the original uniform to achieve complete conformity. In parallel with the sewing of the uniforms, the task of manufacturing accompanying items of equipment was also tackled. German soldiers wore special belts, bags, canteens, and helmets with distinctive features. Each element required a separate production technology. Copying German helmets proved particularly difficult. Their shape, metal thickness, and the method of attaching the chin strap differed fundamentally from Soviet models. Documents were no less complicated. German military ID cards, passes, and certificates were made on special paper with watermarks, security threads, and special printing inks. Soviet printing specialists studied each sample under a microscope, analyzing the composition of the paper and ink. The printing house that produced the forged documents worked under the strictest secrecy. However, the most reliable way to obtain German uniforms was to capture them directly from the battlefield. Special groups of sappers and scouts were ordered to collect captured German equipment in the best condition. Preference was given to the uniforms of killed officers and non-commissioned officers, as their equipment was of higher quality and more prestigious. Trophy uniforms were carefully sorted by size, condition, and completeness. Damaged items were sent to workshops for study and use as samples. Undamaged uniforms were disinfected and repaired, then sent to special warehouses, from where they were distributed to sabotage groups before operations. Gradually, an entire system was created to supply saboteurs with German equipment. By the end of 1941, Soviet workshops were able to manufacture almost all elements of German military uniforms that were not inferior to the originals in quality. This became a crucial factor in the success of subsequent sabotage operations. Operation Monastery was one of the most daring attempts to use Soviet saboteurs in German uniform in the early stages of the war. The plan for the operation was conceived in November 1941, when German troops approached Moscow at a critically close distance. The Abwehr Command developed a plan to physically eliminate Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin with a special commando group led by SS Obersturmführer Otto Skorzeny. Soviet intelligence, through its sources in Germany, received information about the assassination plot. The NKVD leadership decided not only to prevent the German operation, but also to carry out its own counter-sabotage operation. The idea was for Soviet agents, posing as German saboteurs, to infiltrate Skorzeny's group and eliminate it from within. A group of 8 people was formed to carry out this top-secret mission, led by State Security Captain Nikolai Ivanovich Kuznetsov. Kuznetsov had unique qualifications for such an operation. He was fluent in German, had acting skills, and extensive experience in intelligence work. His German was so flawless that even native speakers could not suspect a fake. Preparations for the operation took place in strict secrecy at a special training center near Moscow. The team members received documents in the names of German SS officers who had allegedly arrived from Berlin to carry out a special mission. The cover stories were worked out in minute detail. Each German officer knew the history of his fictitious unit, the names of his commanders, and the specifics of service in various regions of the Third Reich. Special attention was paid to the group's equipment. The participants in the operation received high-quality SS officer uniforms made in special NKVD workshops. Every detail, from buttons to epaulets, corresponded exactly to German standards. The weapons were also exclusively German: MP-40 submachine guns, Walther pistols, and standard hand grenades. The group was transferred to the enemy rear across the front line in the Kaluga area. The saboteurs had to travel about 100 kilometers through occupied territory, posing as a special SS group heading to Moscow on a secret mission. The route was carefully studied, and places for rest and replenishment were marked. The first days of the operation were successful. Kuznetsov's group passed several German checkpoints without incident, and their documents did not arouse suspicion among the inspectors. Moreover, German officers showed particular respect for members of elite SS units, which greatly facilitated their progress. The Soviet saboteurs obtained valuable information about the location of German units and defensive structures. However, on the fifth day of the operation, the group encountered unexpected difficulties. During a check at the headquarters of a German division, an Abwehr officer suspected something was wrong with the behavior of one of the group members. Junior Lieutenant Petrov, who was playing the role of an SS Untersturmführer, made a mistake in his military salute, which alerted the experienced intelligence officer. A firefight ensued, during which 3 Soviet saboteurs were killed, including Kuznetsov himself. The remaining members of the group tried to break through to their own lines, but were surrounded by superior enemy forces. 2 were captured and, after brutal torture, were shot. Only 3 managed to reach Soviet positions and report on the results of the operation. Despite its tragic outcome, Operation Monastery provided valuable experience in the use of saboteurs in German uniform. An analysis of the reasons for the failure showed the need for even more thorough training of agents and the development of new methods of concealment. In December 1941, when the fate of Moscow hung in the balance, the Red Army Command decided to make extensive use of saboteurs in German uniform as part of a counter-offensive near the capital. By this time, special units of the NKVD and GRU had accumulated sufficient experience in preparing and conducting such operations, and the defeats of the first months of the war forced a rethink of tactics. The counteroffensive plan called for simultaneous strikes against German communications by regular units and sabotage groups. The latter were to operate deep behind enemy lines, disrupting the supply, communications, and command of German troops. Wearing German uniforms allowed the saboteurs to penetrate strategically important targets unhindered and launch surprise attacks. One of the most successful operations was the raid by Major Dmitry Nikolaevich Medvedev's group on the railway communications in the Mojaisk area. 18 saboteurs, dressed in the uniforms of German railway guards, managed to infiltrate a large marshalling yard and blow up a train carrying ammunition intended for German units storming Moscow. The success of the operation was ensured by the careful development of a cover story. The saboteurs posed as a team that had arrived to inspect the security of railway facilities. Their documents were made based on captured samples and did not arouse suspicion among the German guards. The group moved freely around the station, studying the layout of the facilities and planning the sabotage. The train was blown up when the station was packed with trains. The explosion set off a chain reaction that destroyed 7 trains carrying military cargo and damaged tracks for several kilometers. Train traffic was paralyzed for 4 days, seriously complicating the supply of German troops on the eve of the Soviet offensive. Another group under the command of Senior Lieutenant Alexander Vasilyevich Kozlov acted against German fuel depots in the Istra area. 12 saboteurs dressed as German sappers infiltrated the supply base, posing as fire safety specialists. They managed to mine several large fuel tanks and detonate them simultaneously. The fire at the fuel depot lasted 3 days and was visible for many kilometers. The fire destroyed fuel reserves intended to supply an entire tank division for a week. The German command was forced to transfer fuel from other areas, which disrupted plans for offensive operations and weakened the striking power of armored units. The operation to destroy the German headquarters in the village of Krasnaya Poliana received particular attention. A group of 10 men led by Captain Ivan Petrovich Startsev, dressed as communications officers, infiltrated the headquarters of the German division under the guise of couriers, with important reports from higher command. The attack on the headquarters took place during a meeting of regimental commanders. The saboteurs burst into the meeting room and, in a short firefight, killed the division commander, the chief of staff, and several regimental commanders. Important documents containing plans for the German offensive on Moscow were captured. Although most of the saboteurs were killed during the retreat, the information obtained proved extremely valuable to the Soviet command. The successes of the sabotage groups in the Battle of Moscow demonstrated the high effectiveness of using German uniforms for special operations. The enemy suffered significant losses in manpower and equipment, and its supply and command systems were disrupted. Equally important, the actions of the Soviet saboteurs had a strong psychological impact on German troops, creating an atmosphere of mistrust and suspicion. The Leningrad front became a special arena for Soviet saboteurs in German uniforms. The blockade of the city created unique conditions where every ton of cargo delivered to the enemy or destroyed by saboteurs could significantly affect the course of the fighting. The specific nature of the theater of operations required the development of new tactical techniques and methods for training sabotage groups. The Leningrad Front Command, led by General Leonid Alexandrovich Govorov, highly valued the potential of sabotage warfare. As early as January 1942, a special group for planning sabotage operations was set up at the front headquarters, headed by Colonel Pyotr Petrovich Proskurin, an experienced Chekist who knew German well and had experience working in Europe. Initially, the main problem was to provide the saboteurs with high-quality German uniforms. Under the conditions of the blockade, it was extremely difficult to deliver equipment from the central workshops. It was necessary to organize local production using captured samples and materials obtained during combat operations. Secret workshops operated in the basements of Leningrad, where experienced tailors recreated elements of German military uniforms. The terrain around Leningrad, swamps, forests, numerous rivers, and lakes created ideal conditions for sabotage groups to move around undetected. However, these same factors required special training for fighters to operate in difficult natural conditions. Saboteurs had to be able to move silently through the swamps, cross water obstacles, and navigate through dense forests. One of the most successful operations was the raid by Captain Vasily Ivanovich Zakharov's group against a German supply base in the Luga area. 14 saboteurs, dressed in Wehrmacht uniforms, infiltrated a large warehouse complex where food supplies were stored for German units blocking Leningrad from the south. Zakharov and his men operated under the cover of a transport team that had arrived to take cargo to the front lines. Their documents were made from captured samples and contained all the necessary stamps and signatures. The saboteurs moved freely around the base, studying the layout of the warehouses and planning their destruction. The sabotage was carried out on the night of February 15, 1942. Zakharov's group simultaneously set fire to 7 food warehouses using homemade incendiary mixtures. The fire quickly spread through the wooden buildings, destroying food supplies intended to feed an entire army corps for 2 weeks. The loss of food supplies seriously complicated the supply of German troops and forced the command to transfer reserves from other areas. This weakened the pressure on Leningrad and gave the city's defenders a much-needed respite. Zakharov's group managed to return safely to Soviet territory, losing only 1 fighter. Another operation carried out in March 1942 was directed against the German communications system. A group led by Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Stepanovich Petrov, disguised as German signalmen, infiltrated the communications center that controlled the artillery shelling Leningrad. The saboteurs cut telephone cables and disabled radio stations, disrupting coordination between observation posts and firing positions. The operation resulted in a significant reduction in the effectiveness of German artillery fire on the city. The lack of reliable communications prevented fire controllers from quickly transmitting data on the results of the shelling, which led to a large expenditure of ammunition with minimal damage to targets. It took the Germans almost a week to restore the communication system. The success of sabotage operations on the Leningrad front contributed to the development of this method of fighting the enemy. By the summer of 1942, the Front Command had several specially trained sabotage groups capable of operating in German uniform for long periods of time. The partisan movement in the occupied areas of the Soviet Union took on a new dimension with the introduction of German military uniforms. While the regular sabotage groups of the NKVD and GRU operated as professional military units, the partisan detachments that gained access to German uniforms were able to significantly expand the geography and scale of their operations. The initiative to use German uniforms by the partisans belonged to the commander of the For the Motherland detachment, Sidor Artemyevich Kovpak. Back in the spring of 1942, his scouts noticed that small groups in German uniforms could move relatively freely through the occupied territory without arousing the enemy's suspicion. Kovpak approached the command with a proposal to organize a special group to carry out sabotage operations under the guise of German soldiers. The central headquarters of the partisan movement approved the initiative and sent a group of instructors from among experienced Chekists to Kovpak's detachment. They were tasked with teaching the partisans the basics of conspiracy, the German language, and the peculiarities of Wehrmacht soldiers' behavior. However, it quickly became clear that the partisans required a fundamentally different approach to training than professional intelligence officers. Most of the partisans were simple peasants and workers with no special education. Learning German was very difficult for them, and the need to memorize complex military terms and regulations seemed an impossible task. It was necessary to develop a simplified training method designed for people with limited language skills. The solution was found in the creation of mixed groups, where 1 or 2 partisans with knowledge of German acted as translators for the other fighters, who pretended to be soldiers from other countries, Hungarians, Romanians, Croats. This cover story explained their poor command of German and allowed them to avoid lengthy conversations with the enemy. The first major operation by a partisan group in German uniform was carried out in June 1942 in the Bryansk forests. 18 partisans from Covpak's detachment, dressed in captured German uniforms, infiltrated the enemy garrison in the village of Navlia, posing as a unit that had arrived to reinforce the security of the railway line. The partisans managed to gain the trust of the German command and obtain detailed information about the security system of the strategically important railway bridge across the Navlia River. This information allowed the main forces of the detachment to plan and carry out a successful sabotage operation, as a result of which the bridge was blown up and train traffic on this section was paralyzed for 2 weeks. The success of the operation inspired other partisan detachments to use similar tactics. In Belarus, a group of partisans under the command of Tikhon Pimenovich Bumashkov began to systematically use German uniforms to carry out reconnaissance operations. Disguised partisans infiltrated German garrisons, studied troop dispositions, security systems, and enemy plans. The tactic of false patrols proved particularly effective. Small groups of partisans in German uniforms posed as military patrols, checking documents and fighting bandits. This allowed them to move freely throughout the occupied territory, gather intelligence, and establish contacts with the local population. One of the most daring operations was the liberation of Soviet prisoners of war from a camp near Polotsk. A group of 12 partisans dressed as German guards infiltrated the camp under the guise of a team arriving to transport prisoners to labor camps. They managed to lead 43 prisoners of war out of the camp, who later joined the ranks of the partisan detachment. The use of German uniforms by the partisans had not only tactical but also important psychological significance. The appearance of German soldiers helping the local population and fighting against the occupiers undermined the authority of the German authorities and demonstrated the vulnerability of the enemy. This contributed to the growth of anti-fascist sentiments among the population of the occupied territories. However, the use of German uniforms by the partisans had its limitations. The insufficient language and technical training of the fighters led to frequent failures of operations. In addition, the German command, faced with this tactic, began to take countermeasures, tightening document checks and introducing additional methods of identifying its units. Operation Barisino became one of the largest and most successful uses of Soviet saboteurs in German uniforms in Belarus. The idea for the operation was conceived in August 1942 at the Western Front headquarters, when German troops were preparing to advance on Rozhev and Sychevka. The command decided to launch a diversionary strike against enemy communications in Belarus using special sabotage groups. Colonel Ilya Grigorievich Starinov, a recognized expert in sabotage warfare, was entrusted with planning the operation. Starinov proposed using large sabotage groups of up to 40 men each, who were to operate under the guise of German units sent to fight the partisans. This cover story explained the presence of large quantities of explosives and special equipment. The most highly trained saboteurs from a separate motorized rifle brigade of the NKVD were recruited to participate in the operation. All participants underwent additional training, including studying the peculiarities of the Belarusian dialect of German and the specific actions of punitive units. Particular attention was paid to psychological training. The saboteurs had to be prepared for long operations deep behind enemy lines. The first group, commanded by Major Anatoly Petrovich Markov, was sent to the Borisov area with the task of destroying a large railway junction. 32 saboteurs, dressed in Wehrmacht Guard uniforms, entered the city under the guise of reinforcements for the local garrison. Their documents were prepared with exceptional care and contained all the necessary stamps and signatures. Markov's group not only managed to pass all the checks without hindrance, but also obtained detailed information about the security system of the railway facilities from the German command. The saboteurs spent 4 days in the city studying the location of strategic facilities and planning the operation. The local population, seeing German soldiers, treated them with natural suspicion, which provided additional cover. The sabotage was carried out on the night of August 27, 1942. Markov's group simultaneously blew up a railway bridge across the Barisino River. The station building, 17 cars with military cargo, and a water tower. The explosions thundered at intervals of several minutes, creating the impression of a massive air raid. Train traffic on this section was paralyzed for 3 weeks. The second group, led by Captain Dmitry Vasilievich Kozlov, targeted German fuel and ammunition depots in the Minsk area. 28 saboteurs dressed as SS sappers infiltrated a large supply base, posing as fire safety specialists. Their mission was supposedly to check compliance with safety precautions for the storage of explosives and fuel. The cover story was chosen deliberately. After several major fires in German warehouses, the Wehrmacht command had indeed tightened control over compliance with fire safety regulations. Kozlov's group managed to inspect all the warehouse premises and identify the most vulnerable places for planting explosives. The saboteurs worked openly, making notes in notebooks and photographing safety violations. The German guards not only did not interfere with their work, but also provided every assistance, fearing punishment for shortcomings in the organization of the warehouse. Over the course of 2 days, the saboteurs secretly installed delayed action explosive devices at key points of the supply base. They used special mines developed in NKVD laboratories that imitated the spontaneous combustion of combustible materials. This was intended to disguise the sabotage as an accident and avoid reprisals against the local population. The explosions occurred 8 hours after Kozlov's group left. The detonation of the ammunition depots caused a chain reaction that destroyed the entire supply base. The fire burned for 3 days, and the column of smoke was visible from 50 kilometers away. German losses amounted to more than 2,000 tons of ammunition, 800 tons of fuel, and a significant amount of food supplies. The third group, led by Major Vladimir Ivanovich Petrov, was sent to the Mogilev area to carry out operations against German airfields. 35 saboteurs dressed as Luftwaffe technical personnel were to destroy aircraft and aviation equipment at several airfields simultaneously. This part of the operation was considered the most difficult due to the increased vigilance of German aviation security. Petrov's group split into 3 subgroups, each assigned to a specific airfield. The saboteurs infiltrated the air bases, posing as maintenance specialists who had arrived from Germany to carry out scheduled repairs on aviation equipment. Their documents contained instructions for the urgent repair of technical faults identified during inspections. The operation at the airfields was carried out simultaneously on the night of August 30th. The saboteurs mined the fuel tanks of aircraft, ammunition depots, and repair workshops. The explosions destroyed 43 combat aircraft, including the latest Messerschmitt fighters and Heinkel bombers. German aviation in the area was put out of action for almost a month. Operation Barisino demonstrated the high effectiveness of large sabotage groups in German uniform. In a week of combat operations, the enemy lost facilities that would have taken months of work and enormous material costs to build and equip. Equally important, the operation forced the German command to transfer additional security units to Belarus, weakening other sections of the front. Ukrainian territory became the scene of particularly intensive use of Soviet saboteurs in German uniform. The specific characteristics of the region, the presence of large industrial centers, a developed transport network, and strategically important agricultural areas, made Ukraine a priority target for sabotage operations. In addition, a significant part of the local population spoke German, which facilitated the preparation and conduct of operations. Sabotage activities in Ukraine were coordinated by a special department at the headquarters of the Southwestern Front, headed by Colonel Sergei Alexeyevich Vaupshasov. Vaupshasov had extensive experience in intelligence work in Western Europe and understood perfectly the specifics of operations deep behind enemy lines. Under his leadership, a system of long-term operations was developed, designed for months of continuous work behind German lines. A distinctive feature of Ukrainian operations was the creation of stationary residencies, whose members were embedded in German military and administrative structures for long periods of time. Unlike the short-term raids practiced in other regions, Ukrainian saboteurs had to live for weeks and months under false names, gradually gaining the trust of the enemy and studying their plans from within. One of the most successful long-term operations was the activities of Major Nikolai Ivanovich Kuznetsov's group in Rivne. Kuznetsov, operating under the name of German officer Paul Siebert, managed to infiltrate the highest circles of the German administration of the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. His impeccable knowledge of German, European manners, and acting skills allowed him to become one of their own among the occupation authorities. For 8 months, Kuznetsov, posing as an Abwehr officer, gathered valuable intelligence about the plans of the German command. He attended secret meetings, had access to classified documents, and maintained friendly relations with high-ranking German officials. The information he passed on to the center formed the basis for the planning of several major offensive operations by the Red Army. In addition to his intelligence activities, Kuznetsov also carried out sabotage operations. Using his position, he organized the elimination of several high-ranking German officers, including General Commissar of Ukraine, Erich Koch, and SD Security Service Chief Obergruppenführer Hans Kinzel. These actions made a huge impression on the German command and forced it to tighten security measures. Another major operation was carried out in Kharkiv by a group led by Captain Anatoly Petrovich Kravtsov. 15 saboteurs, disguised as members of various German services, spent 3 months gathering information about German plans to use Ukrainian industry. Particular attention was paid to studying the security system of strategic enterprises and plans for their evacuation to Germany. The culmination of the Kharkiv operation was the simultaneous destruction of several key industrial facilities. On the night of March 15, 1943, saboteurs blew up a tractor factory, an aircraft factory, and a large power plant. The explosions were carried out with such precision that it took many months of work and huge material costs to restore the enterprises. Saboteurs operating against German railway communications played a special role in Ukrainian operations. The Ukrainian railway network was of strategic importance for supplying German troops on the southern section of the Eastern Front. Disrupting railway communications could paralyze the supply of entire army groups. The group led by Senior Lieutenant Ivan Morozov specialized in sabotage against rail transport in the Poltava area. 20 saboteurs dressed as German railway troops carried out systematic operations against military trains carrying reinforcements and combat equipment to the front. In 4 months of activity, the group destroyed 18 trains and seriously disrupted the military transport schedule. The successes of the Ukrainian sabotage groups forced the German command to take emergency measures to strengthen security in the rear. Special units were created to combat saboteurs. Additional document checks were introduced, and security at strategic sites was tightened. However, this required the diversion of significant forces from the front, which weakened the combat capabilities of the German troops. The Ukrainian operations demonstrated the potential for the long-term use of saboteurs in German uniform to achieve strategic objectives. They showed that properly organized sabotage activities could have an impact on the course of military operations comparable to the results of major battles. Not all operations carried out by Soviet saboteurs in German uniform were successful. The war placed cruel demands on those involved in special operations, and even the slightest mistake could cost not only the life of the agent himself, but also that of the entire group. Analysis of failed operations became an important part of improving the methods of training and conducting sabotage. One of the most tragic episodes was the death of Captain Alexei Fedorovich Fedorov's group in January 1943 near Smolensk. 14 saboteurs, dressed in Wehrmacht uniforms, were supposed to destroy a German ammunition depot. The operation was carefully planned, and the group underwent intensive training. But fate decided otherwise. The failure was due to an unfortunate accident. While crossing a frozen river, one of the saboteurs, Sergeant Pyotr Vasilyevich Ivanov, fell through the ice. His comrades rushed to save him, but in the confusion, he lost his documents, which were swept away by the current under the ice. Without his documents, Ivanov could not continue participating in the operation, and a change in the group's composition threatened to expose the entire cover story. The group commander decided to continue the operation, leaving Ivanov in the forest under the guard of one of the fighters. However, the reduction in the group's numbers did not go unnoticed. A German non-commissioned officer checking documents at a checkpoint noticed a discrepancy between the list of unit members indicated in the documents and the actual number of people. A firefight ensued, during which 10 Soviet saboteurs were killed, including Captain Fyodorov. 2 were captured and, after brutal torture, were shot. Only 2 managed to break through to their own side and report on the tragedy. The ammunition depot remained intact, and the enemy obtained valuable information about Soviet methods of sabotage warfare. Another failure occurred due to betrayal. In March 1943, a group led by Major Vladimir Petrovich Petrov was preparing for an operation against a German airfield near Pskov. 20 saboteurs spent a week studying the facility and planning the sabotage. However, their location was revealed to the Germans by a Soviet prisoner of war who agreed to cooperate. German counterintelligence set up an ambush at the sabotage group's meeting place. The Soviet fighters were surrounded and engaged in an unequal battle. Despite their heroic resistance, the entire group was killed, failing to complete their mission. The traitor received his promised reward, but a month later, he was eliminated by another Soviet sabotage group. Errors in the production of fake documents became a serious problem. In May 1943, Captain Nikolai Stepanovich Kozlov's group was exposed due to inaccuracies in the design of their military ID cards. A German gendarme noticed that the stamp on the document did not match the sample used in the military district from which the saboteurs were supposed to have come. Although Kozlov's group managed to avoid capture, the operation was foiled and the enemy obtained samples of Soviet forgeries. This forced the Germans to tighten document checks and introduce additional security measures. Soviet document forgers had to urgently improve their technology for producing fake papers. An analysis of the reasons for the failures showed the need to improve the training of saboteurs for action in extreme situations. A new training program was developed, which included practicing actions in case of exposure, injury of comrades, loss of documents, and other emergency situations. Particular attention was paid to psychological preparation for torture and interrogation. The tragic losses also forced a review of the selection system for personnel for sabotage operations. In addition to professional qualities, the psychological stability of candidates and their ability to maintain self-control in critical situations began to be taken into account. Additional checks were introduced to identify possible tendencies toward betrayal. Each failure was carefully analyzed by a special commission, which developed recommendations to prevent similar situations in the future. The experience of unsuccessful operations became part of the training program, allowing new generations of saboteurs to avoid the mistakes of their predecessors. Despite all the difficulties and losses, the Soviet command did not abandon the use of saboteurs in German uniform. Successful operations proved the high effectiveness of this method of fighting the enemy, and failures only stimulated the improvement of tactics and methods of training specialists. The use of Soviet saboteurs in German uniform had a powerful psychological impact on the enemy, which often exceeded the material damage caused by sabotage. German soldiers and officers, accustomed to strict discipline and mutual trust, were faced with a situation where any fellow soldier could turn out to be a disguised enemy. This created an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that undermined the foundations of military organization. The first cases of Soviet saboteurs being exposed made a shocking impression on the German command. General Heinz Guderian noted in his memoirs that news of the actions of disguised Russian saboteurs caused almost panic among the soldiers. The Germans could not understand how their enemies had mastered such subtleties of German military life and managed to imitate the behavior of Wehrmacht soldiers so convincingly. Operations in which Soviet saboteurs spent long periods of time in German units without arousing suspicion had a particularly strong impact. When it became clear that a German officer who had been serving in the division headquarters for weeks was actually a Soviet intelligence agent, it came as a shock to everyone who had interacted with him. Soldiers began to doubt the authenticity of their commanders and comrades. The German command tried to combat the psychological effect of Soviet sabotage by issuing special orders and instructions. Soldiers were taught how to recognize disguised enemies, peculiarities of pronunciation, ignorance of German customs, and inappropriate behavior in everyday situations. However, these measures only increased suspicion and created additional nervousness. The psychological impact was reinforced by the Soviet command's skillful propaganda work. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, and other means of propaganda actively used facts about successful sabotage operations to undermine the enemy's morale. German soldiers were led to believe that there were Soviet agents among them, ready to strike at any moment. Disinformation operations carried out by saboteurs in German uniform proved particularly effective. False orders, contradictory instructions, and distorted information about the command's plans created chaos in German units. Soldiers did not know which orders to trust and which came from disguised saboteurs. One of the most striking examples of psychological warfare was Operation Ghost, carried out in the winter of 1943 to 1944 in the Vitebsk region. For a month, a small group of Soviet saboteurs appeared in various German units disguised as officers from higher headquarters. They conducted inspections, gave strange orders, and arrested soldiers on trumped-up charges. The German garrison in Vitebsk was in a state of nervous breakdown. Soldiers were afraid to carry out orders, fearing that they came from Soviet saboteurs. Officers did not trust each other, suspecting their colleagues of possible treason. The combat readiness of the units declined sharply, which facilitated the subsequent advance of the Red Army in the area. The psychological effect of the Soviet saboteurs' actions spread far beyond the area of operations. Rumors of Russian werewolves spread throughout the Eastern Front, creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. German soldiers began to see potential saboteurs everywhere, which led to numerous false alarms and incidents involving the use of weapons. The Wehrmacht command was forced to divert significant forces to ensure security in its own rear. Special units were created to search for saboteurs, additional checkpoints and inspections were introduced, and access restrictions were tightened. This weakened the combat units at the front and reduced the effectiveness of military operations. Gradually, an atmosphere of mutual distrust developed in German units, which seriously undermined the foundations of military discipline. Soldiers reported on each other, suspecting them of having ties to the enemy. Officers avoided making important decisions, afraid of being accused of sabotage. This led to a decline in initiative and morale among German troops. The psychological impact of Soviet saboteurs in German uniforms became one of the most important factors in winning the information war. It showed that well-organized special operations could influence the morale of the enemy no less than large military battles. The post-war fates of those who took part in sabotage operations in German uniform varied. Many of those who survived the harsh conditions of war faced new challenges in peacetime. The specifics of their military activities, shrouded in secrecy, did not always receive due recognition, and sometimes even became a cause for suspicion on the part of the punitive authorities. One of the few who received well-deserved recognition was Ivan Grigorievich Starinov. The legendary saboteur was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union and continued to serve in the Soviet Army, passing on his experience to new generations of military specialists. He participated in the development of training programs for special units and wrote several books on guerrilla warfare and sabotage tactics. The fate of many ordinary participants in the operations was tragic. In the post-war years, during the struggle against cosmopolitanism and suspicion of those who had contacts with the West, some veterans of the sabotage war were subjected to repression. Their knowledge of foreign languages, European manners, and experience working abroad aroused the suspicion of the state security services. The fate of those saboteurs who were captured by the Germans and managed to survive the concentration camps was particularly harsh. Upon their return to their homeland, they were subjected to lengthy investigations on suspicion of possible collaboration with the enemy. Many of them were sent to Gulag camps, where they spent many years before being rehabilitated during Khrushchev's thaw. The fate of Nikolai Ivanovich Kuznetsov became a symbol of the heroism and tragedy of Soviet intelligence agents. Killed in March 1944 in a battle with Ukrainian nationalists, he was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. His name became legendary, but many details of his activities remained classified for decades. Some participants in sabotage operations continued their careers in state security agencies after the war. Their unique experience working deep behind enemy lines, knowledge of foreign languages, and skills in conspiracy proved to be in high demand during the early years of the Cold War. They participated in the creation of new intelligence schools and the training of agents for work in capitalist countries. Other veterans chose peaceful professions, trying to forget the horrors of war. Many became foreign language teachers, translators, and cultural workers. Their military experience helped them in their professional activities, but they rarely spoke about their participation in secret operations, keeping their secrets even from close relatives. For a long time, the activities of Soviet saboteurs in German uniform remained classified. It was only in the 1970s and 1980s that the first publications about the exploits of these heroes began to appear. Writers and journalists gained access to declassified archives and began to reconstruct the history of wartime special operations. Gradually, society came to understand the importance of the saboteurs' contribution to the overall victory. Monuments were erected, museum exhibitions were created, books were written, and films were made about the exploits of Soviet intelligence agents. The names of heroes who had long remained in the shadows became part of history. Medical research showed that many veterans of sabotage operations suffered from psychological trauma sustained during the war. Constant nervous tension, the need to live under a false identity, and the fear of exposure and death left deep scars on people's psyche. Not everyone was able to successfully adapt to peaceful life. The families of the deceased saboteurs did not know the truth about the fate of their loved ones for a long time. Official notifications contained standard phrases about death in the line of duty, without revealing the specifics of military activities. Only decades later were relatives able to learn the details of the exploits of their fathers, husbands, and sons. Today, 80 years after the end of the war, we can truly appreciate the contribution of Soviet saboteurs in German uniform to the overall victory. Their exploits have become part of the heroic history of the Great Patriotic War, and their experience is used in the training of modern special forces. Summing up the use of Soviet saboteurs in German uniform during the Great Patriotic War, we can say with confidence that this tactic became one of the most effective and innovative methods of conducting special operations. During the 4 years of the war, hundreds of Soviet scouts and saboteurs risked their lives to penetrate deep into enemy territory, striking sensitive targets where they were least expected. Statistical data declassified in the post-Soviet period testify to the impressive results of sabotage activities. During the war, Soviet saboteurs dressed in German uniforms destroyed more than 500 trains carrying military supplies, blew up 137 bridges, and put 82 ammunition and fuel depots out of action. The enemy lost tens of thousands of men killed and wounded. However, the material damage inflicted on the enemy was only part of the overall effect of the sabotage operations. Equally important was the psychological impact on German troops, creating an atmosphere of mistrust and suspicion that forced the enemy to divert significant forces to ensure security in their own rear. According to military historians, up to 30% of German security forces were involved in fighting saboteurs. Intelligence gathered by agents in German uniform was of enormous strategic value. German operational plans, troop deployment data, information about new types of weapons, and much more were sent to Soviet headquarters and used to plan their own military operations. In some cases, timely intelligence prevented catastrophic defeats and saved thousands of lives. The most important achievement was the creation of a unique training system for special operations. Soviet sabotage schools developed methods that made it possible to quickly train highly skilled specialists capable of operating in the most difficult conditions. This experience proved to be in demand in the post-war period, when the confrontation between the two world systems began. An analysis of the operations showed the exceptional importance of thorough training for agents. The success of the missions depended directly on the quality of language training, knowledge of German military traditions and culture, and the ability to transform oneself. Saboteurs had to not only speak German, but think like Germans and feel like part of the enemy's military machine. The technical side of the operations also required the highest level of professionalism. The production of fake documents, the recreation of German military uniforms, and the mastery of enemy weapons and equipment all became separate areas of special training. Soviet master forgers achieved such a level of skill that their products often surpassed the original German models in quality. The experience of using saboteurs in German uniforms influenced the development of military art far beyond the Soviet Union. The Allies studied Soviet methods and adapted them to their own needs. After the war, similar tactics were used in various regional conflicts and became an integral part of the arsenal of special forces in many countries. The human cost of these operations was enormous. According to various estimates, between 3,000 and 5,000 Soviet intelligence officers and saboteurs died in sabotage operations while wearing German uniforms. Many of them remained nameless heroes, whose names are still hidden in classified archives. Their feat became an important, albeit little-known page in the history of the Great Patriotic War. Modern experts highly appreciate the innovative nature of Soviet sabotage tactics. The use of enemy uniforms for special operations required not only technical skill, but also a deep understanding of the enemy's psychology. This was a qualitatively new level of covert warfare that anticipated many of the methods used by modern special services. The legacy of Soviet saboteurs in German uniforms lives on today. Their experience continues to be studied in military academies and special operations training centers around the world. The principles laid down during the war remain relevant today, when the conflict has taken on new forms and dimensions.